The real band of brothers. The unbelievable true story of Easy Company. On June 6, 1944, across the English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion in human history began. But the story of Easy Company, 506th Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, was not one of dramatic beach landings or immediate glory. It was something far more complex, a unit that would endure not days or weeks, but months of sustained combat, leadership challenges, and the slow erosion that came from being understaffed, under-resourced, and repeatedly thrust into situations where doctrine met the grinding reality of modern warfare. Easy Company would become known through the 2001 television series. But the actual history of the men who served in that unit reveals a different narrative than the one Hollywood told. It is a story about how ordinary soldiers are led by officers who learned their trade under fire, adapted to a war that demanded flexibility over training manual procedure. The unit's origins traced back to the summer of 1942. The 506th Regiment was activated at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, a sprawling facility in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The men who arrived there, draftees, volunteers, and a corps of professional soldiers, had no idea they would become part of something historic. They only knew they were assigned to a parachute regiment, which meant 6 weeks of the most physically demanding training the Army could devise. The training sergeant was a man named Bill Evans. He was not a household name then, and he is not now. Evans was a career soldier in his late 30s, lean and weathered, who had been assigned to physically condition the recruits for airborne duty. Now his job was not to prepare them for combat. The military's doctrine held that training centers trained soldiers for basic tasks: marksmanship, map reading, physical conditioning. Combat preparation would come later, at specialized schools, or through combat experience itself. This separation between training and reality would define much of Easy Company's first year. The company was formally constituted in December 1942 under the command of Captain Herbert Sobel. Sobel was a career officer who believed rigidly in Army regulation and procedure. He ran the company with attention to detail and enforcement of the rulebook. The men under his command found him exacting and at times petty. But he was not unusual for his era. Hundreds of American officers commanded with similar methods. What made Sobel different, though not immediately apparent, was how his approach would clash with the environment Easy Company would soon enter. Throughout 1943, Easy Company trained at Camp Toccoa, then at Fort Benning, then at bases in England. The men learned to pack parachutes, to exit aircraft in formation, to land and assemble. They marched. They qualified with rifles. They studied maps. They performed endless military drills. The routine was monotonous, the discipline was strict, and the men, over time, began to understand one another. Units do not form overnight. They form through repetition, through shared hardship, through the accumulation of small moments of trust and competence under observation. But Easy Company's officers were increasingly aware that something was missing from their training. Parachute school taught men how to exit an aircraft and land, and it did not teach them how to move through a dark Norman hedgerow. It did not teach them how to clear a house occupied by armed men. It did not teach them how to function when visibility was reduced to a few feet, when communication broke down, and when the map bore no resemblance to the ground beneath their feet. Captain Sobel was aware of this gap. The official Army doctrine stated that company officers bore responsibility for ensuring their soldiers understood basic combat tasks, but the doctrine did not specify how or how much. Training schedules were crowded. There was no separate course for what would later be called small unit tactics. So Sobel did what he believed was appropriate. He enforced discipline and expected that when the time came, the men would perform their duty. In the spring of 1944, Easy Company moved to the Airborne airfield in England, near the Wiltshire border. The company was now at full strength, roughly 120 men, divided into 3 platoons. The soldiers lived in Nissen huts. They were issued new equipment. Intelligence briefings began. Maps of Normandy appeared on officers' desks. The invasion was coming. The company knew it. The only uncertainty was when. Among the men was a young lieutenant named Richard Winters. Winters had joined the Army in 1941, fresh from the University of Pennsylvania. He was neither flashy nor particularly ambitious. He was methodical. He read military history. He thought about tactics. Unlike Sobel, Winters believed that soldiers learned by questioning and by understanding the reason behind orders. He believed in building confidence through competence. But these two views, Sobel's emphasis on regulation, Winters' emphasis on reasoning, would create a fault line within Easy Company's leadership structure. By early June 1944, the tension was building. The men sensed that their role would begin soon. Sobel, aware that his command would soon be evaluated under combat conditions, intensified discipline. Winters and the other junior officers began conducting unofficial training sessions at night, teaching men how to move quietly, how to react to ambush, how to think through a firefight rather than simply following orders. The manual did not explicitly forbid this, but it was also not in the manual. This was the first clear instance of Easy Company's leadership operating outside the official framework, not in rebellion, but in recognition that the framework did not address the problem. In the early hours of June 5, 1944, Easy Company was assembled for final briefing. The men were issued live ammunition. They were loaded into transport trucks. They drove to the airfield. The C-47 transports waited, their engines already running, their interiors dark and cold. The men filed aboard, parachutes already worn. The aircraft took off around midnight. The invasion of France had begun. The jump itself was chaotic. This is well documented. Anti-aircraft fire damaged many aircraft. Clouds forced pilots to release their paratroopers at low altitude and at too high a speed. Men were scattered across the landscape. Some landed in swamps. Some landed in fields. Some missed the drop zone by miles. Easy Company's men were distributed across a 5-mile radius. By daybreak, only a fraction of the company had assembled together. She had the neat, orderly structure that training had emphasized. Platoons with officers, squads in formation, had simply dissolved in the darkness. What happened next revealed whether training mattered. It did. The men knew their basic skills. They could navigate. They could move quietly. They could assemble in small groups under fire. But they did so not because Sobel had drilled them in parade ground precision. They did so because they understood why the skills mattered. The units that performed best in the chaos of the airborne landings were those whose leaders had taught them to think, not merely to obey. Winters, by chance or providence, found himself with a small group of men from Easy Company. He moved through the Norman bocage, the dense hedgerow terrain, with methodical caution. He did not rush. He kept his men together. And he gathered information about where other units might be. He began, without formal assignment, to take on the role of a de facto commander of whatever fragments of Easy Company he could find or organize. By the end of June 6th, scattered groups had begun coalescing. Winters' growing group came under fire from a German position. Instead of holding in place, Winters arranged his men on a line and moved forward aggressively, using terrain. The German position broke. The men advanced. For the first time, Sobel's command of Easy Company, the discipline, the training, the emphasis on individual competence had been tested under actual fire. And it had worked, though not because of Sobel himself. Sobel had been in an aircraft that did not reach the correct drop zone. He did not link up with Easy Company for several days. At the immediate aftermath of June 6th saw Easy Company consolidated into a larger group under the division's command. The company was used to secure bridges, to patrol hedgerows, to hold defensive positions. The initial shock of combat faded into a grim routine. Men were killed. Men were wounded. Replacements arrived and were integrated into the unit. The experience was nothing like the training. It was slower, more confused, more exhausting, and far more frightening than any exercise had suggested. By late June, Sobel had caught up with his company. He was shocked by what he found. The unit had been in near-continuous combat. Equipment was damaged or missing. Men were sleeping in shifts, never fully rested. And the chain of command had effectively reorganized itself around Winters and the other junior officers who had proven themselves capable under fire. Sobel attempted to restore his authority through increased discipline, insisting on proper uniform standards and enforcing the rulebook. But by this point, the men had experienced combat. They had seen the difference between regulation and effectiveness. Sobel's style, once merely exacting, now seemed disconnected from reality. The official army hierarchy could not ignore this forever. In early July, Sobel was removed from Easy Company's command. The stated reason was that he was reassigned to battalion staff. The actual reason was that his leadership style had become a liability. But the Army could not publicly admit that. Procedure had to be maintained. Sobel was transferred, but Winters was promoted to captain and took command of Easy Company. What followed was a quiet revolution in how Easy Company operated. Winters did not abandon military procedure or discipline, but he restructured them. He explained orders to his men. He listened to feedback from sergeants and squad leaders. He made decisions based on the tactical situation rather than adherence to doctrine. He moved the company away from the casualty-producing methods that had characterized the first weeks of combat. In August 1944, the company participated in the advance toward Paris. The movement was rapid, sometimes chaotic, always dangerous. But Easy Company, now under Winters' command, suffered fewer casualties than other units of comparable size and engagement. The reason was not luck. Just the reason was that Winters had implemented what we might now call an adaptive command structure, one that valued flexibility and communication over rigid hierarchy. By September, Easy Company had advanced beyond Paris and was positioned in Holland ahead of Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne operation designed to capture bridges and allow armored forces to push deep into the Netherlands. The plan called for Easy Company to secure a key crossing. The company was dropped by parachute near the town of Eindhoven. Market Garden was partially successful and partially a failure. Easy Company secured its objective, but the larger operation did not achieve all its goals. The company found itself holding a defensive position in Holland as autumn turned to winter. Resupply was intermittent. Food was rationed, and men suffered from trench foot and dysentery. The Germans remained active nearby, and still the unit held. Throughout this period, Winters continued to develop his command philosophy. He promoted capable, non-commissioned officers. He removed leaders who could not adapt. He fought hard for his men with higher command, pushing back against orders he believed were tactically unsound. He was not insubordinate, but he was not passive. He understood that his first responsibility was to the men under his command, and his second was to the broader military mission. In December 1944, the German army launched a major offensive in Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge. Easy Company was not directly involved in the initial fighting, but it was positioned in a defensive area and understood that a serious German threat existed. The company dug in, and men prepared defensive positions. Then, in late December, Easy Company received orders to move. Intelligence indicated that the situation in Belgium was deteriorating. The company was transported to the Bastogne area to reinforce American positions. This is where Easy Company's story enters what many would recognize as its most dramatic chapter. The company arrived in the Bastogne sector just as the German offensive was reaching its climax. American forces were stretched thin. Supplies were running short. The weather was brutally cold. Visibility was poor. And German forces, in considerable strength, surrounded the American positions. Easy Company was positioned in a wooded area east of Bastogne. The weather was so cold that men could not dig proper foxholes. The ground was frozen solid. They scraped shallow depressions and built log walls and roofs over them. Supplies were minimal. Food was almost non-existent by modern standards. Men burned whatever wood they could find. They stamped their feet constantly to avoid frostbite. And they manned their positions, watching the forest for German movement. The German encirclement of Bastogne is historical fact. The American garrison was surrounded. Resupply came only by air when weather permitted. The situation was genuinely desperate. Higher command offered the German general an opportunity to surrender. He refused. American forces refused to surrender in return. The siege would have to be broken by breakthrough or relieved by advancing American forces. Easy Company's role was not heroic in the sense of dramatic action. The company saw sporadic combat, now defended its positions competently, and endured cold and hunger. The real drama was internal. Men suffered from exhaustion, from fear, from the physical deterioration that came from weeks of cold and inadequate nutrition. Some were wounded. Some suffered what was then called battle fatigue, what we would now recognize as the symptoms of trauma and severe stress. Winters, observing his men, made a decision that violated Army procedure. The company had access to a small number of eggs. According to regulation, these belonged to the company's supply, and all soldiers should receive equal rations. But Winters observed that some men were on the edge of collapse. He ordered that the eggs be given to those men specifically, not equally distributed, but targeted to those who needed them most. If an inspector had arrived, this would have been a violation of procedure. Winters did it anyway. This small act illustrated a principle that Winters had developed throughout his months of combat. Procedure served the mission. When procedure and mission came into conflict, the mission took precedence. The Army's official doctrine stated that all soldiers should be treated identically. The actual situation demanded flexibility. Winters provided it. By late January 1945, the German offensive had failed. American forces had relieved Bastogne and broken through to link up with the encircled garrison. The siege was over. Easy Company had survived. But the experience had changed the unit. Men had seen death up close. They had endured privation. And they had learned that their survival often depended not on official procedure, but on the judgment of the men immediately above them. In the months that followed, Easy Company moved eastward with the advancing American forces. The company crossed the Rhine in March 1945, participated in the encirclement of German forces, and pressed toward the end of the war. The final weeks of combat were, paradoxically, among the most deadly. German forces, even in defeat, fought stubbornly. Easy Company took casualties in operations that, had they occurred months earlier, would have seemed dramatically important. But by April 1945, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The European war was over. Easy Company had survived from D-Day through the surrender, but the unit had suffered 33 killed and numerous wounded. These were not numbers that made headlines. They were not unusual. Hundreds of American units suffered similar losses, but they were real deaths, men who did not go home. What is remarkable about Easy Company is not that it survived or that it fought. What is remarkable is what the unit's experience reveals about the limitations of institutional doctrine in the face of complex reality. Sobel commanded by the book. Winters commanded by judgment, informed by the book, but not constrained by it. The difference was visible in casualty rates, in unit cohesion, and in the morale of the men. After the war, many of Easy Company's men remained in the Army. Winters continued in military service for 20 years, eventually commanding at the battalion level. Yet he was never a high-ranking officer. He never sought promotion. He believed in working with the people immediately under him and solving problems at the lowest competent level rather than escalating them upward. This philosophy, which he had developed under combat conditions, made him an effective leader in peace as well. The broader Army took much longer to institutionalize what Winters and other combat leaders had learned. Military doctrine in the 1950s remained largely hierarchical and procedure-focused. It was not until well into the Cold War that the American military began to formalize the concept of adaptive leadership and mission command. Even then, change was slow. The military is by necessity an institution that values order and procedure. Teaching officers to know when to follow procedure and when to adapt it is complex work. Easy Company's real legacy is not that it performed amazing feats of combat arms. Other units performed equally well. The legacy is what it demonstrated about how organizations actually function when they face complex, novel situations. Sobel represented the institution. Winters represented adaptation. The institution did not adapt gracefully. It took the evidence of failures, units that suffered unnecessarily because their commanders were dogmatically rigid, before the institution acknowledged that flexibility mattered. In the decades since the war, Winters granted interviews, wrote a memoir, and allowed his story to be told in various forms. He was modest about his accomplishments. He did not claim to have done anything unusual. He simply said that he tried to take care of his men and to make decisions based on what the situation demanded rather than what the manual prescribed. The fact that this represented something significant enough to warrant study and preservation reveals something important about institutions. The obvious is often overlooked until someone explicitly points it out. Easy Company's soldiers who survived the war returned to America and lived ordinary lives. Some became prominent. Most did not. All carried with them the experience of having been tested at a level that most humans never face. The company itself was deactivated shortly after the war ended. No organization can sustain a unit that has experienced what Easy Company experienced. The men needed to return to civilian life, to process their experiences, yet to rebuild what war had disrupted. What remains is the historical record. Easy Company participated in the Normandy invasion, the advance across France, the operation in Holland, the siege of Bastogne, the final push into Germany, and the occupation of Germany. The unit suffered casualties. The unit saw combat repeatedly, and the unit demonstrated that how an organization is led, whether leadership emphasizes procedure or judgment, whether it trusts subordinates or micromanages them, whether it treats soldiers as tools or as human beings with needs, matters profoundly. For those interested in military history, Easy Company is instructive not because of the drama of its battles, but because of what its experience reveals about the nature of institutions, leadership, and human performance under extreme stress. And the television series created a narrative arc that emphasized heroism and brotherhood. These elements were real, but the deeper story, the story of how an organization learns, adapts, and survives, is less dramatic but far more important for understanding how institutions actually function when procedure meets reality. Historians and military scholars continue to study the 506th Regiment and Easy Company, because the unit's experience offers lessons that extend far beyond military history. In any large organization, there are leaders who believe that rules are absolute and leaders who believe that rules serve purpose. The reality, as Easy Company's experience showed, is that both are necessary. Rules provide the framework. Judgment provides the flexibility that complex reality demands. Finding the balance between these is not a military problem. It is a fundamental organizational problem. Easy Company's men did not set out to teach a lesson about organizational behavior. They simply tried to survive. The lesson emerged from what they experienced and how their leaders responded to circumstances that the training manual could not anticipate. That lesson, that procedure and flexibility must coexist, that soldiers are individuals with needs as well as duties, that trust and communication matter more than rank and regulation, remains relevant today. The men of Easy Company who are still living are now in their late 90s. They have been interviewed extensively. Their testimony has been recorded. Their experience has been analyzed, yet the basic facts remain simple. Said they were young men thrust into a situation they had not chosen. They performed their duty. They supported one another. They adapted to circumstances they could not control. And some did not come home. What made them worth remembering, beyond the general duty all soldiers owe, is what they revealed about how human beings organize themselves when facing overwhelming challenges. The Army was their organization. Combat was their challenge. Their response, innovative, adaptive, compassionate, offers insight into what institutions are capable of becoming when they are led by people who understand that rules and reality do not always align.